So this is going to be an introduction video and also a review on the 1x20 method put out by Dr. Michael Yessis. The company actually releasing this particular DVD is Ultimate Athletic Concepts, and they put out a lot of great strength conditioning material, a lot of great strength conditioning textbooks as well. This is an hour-long presentation, so it's not really that long that goes in the 1x20 method, and some of you guys may or may not be familiar with the 1x20 method, so I'm going to give you guys a general rundown, just kind of put in like a simple PowerPoint to kind of go over the main points of it. But pretty much it's a kind of a somewhat old method of training, specifically more or less in strength conditioning, working with athletes, and I'll address that. But it's definitely something that seems like it's high volume. And again, the 1x20 is one set for 20 repetitions, give or take, and I'll discuss that because that really fluctuates. But it's a different method of training, so it's something that at the very least it gives you kind of something else to kind of another tool in your tool belt to kind of change things up a bit. And from watching this video and maybe getting a little more in depth with familiarizing yourself with 1x20 method, it might start having you change your initial concepts of training with high intensity for strength training or training at high intensity for working with athletes. And this idea of intensity is somewhat vague a little bit, but I highly recommend if you're interested to pick up this video. I'm going to go over the main concepts of what it is and pretty much how you can put it into your own practice with working with athletes or training yourself for strength conditioning. But for the most part, it's a total body split that is a higher volume repetitions. It's still very hard. It's not going to necessarily be easy, but we're using a little bit less weight. So I kind of go over the ins and outs of this video during this presentation.
So what is that 1x20 method? Basically, obviously, it's one set of 20 repetitions for a given exercise. So you might do, he talks upwards of even 35 exercises in a session, and you're just doing one set of that given exercise, then going on to the next exercise. Now, this 20 number is necessarily like a magical set number. Ideally, you want a 20 rep max. It could be a little bit lower. It could be a little bit higher. Obviously, he said you can go as high as 25 if you wanted to, even higher than that, but that probably means you got to increase the weight. It basically is a total body split. So again, you're not really necessarily focusing on certain body parts, but he does make the case that if depending on your sport, if you're an athlete, if you're let's say a pitcher versus a lineman, a pitcher might have more rotational movements and more specific, again, basic exercises kind of coupled into that exercise or that athlete and versus compared to a lineman, so it is somewhat sport specific. So that's that third point. It has a focus on sport application. So a lot of this is kind of geared towards athletics and strength conditioning, especially for a novice, even collegiate level. Well, it goes even to pro level. But the point is, you're giving a lot of general exposure to different exercises to the athlete, and not just purely training strength and intensity. And we'll kind of talk about that. You're gaining endurance and strength is essentially kind of the crux of what we're getting at with these high repetitions, being that it's quote unquote low intensity, that it's so high in repetitions. So his argument is that, let's say in rep 12, your first, 5 to, let's say 5 to 10 repetitions, you're kind of getting endurance, you're training endurance. When you get to like those last few sets where you're kind of grinding it out, let's say you're doing a 20 rep max and you're at your rep 14 or 15, those last few are actually where you're grinding out and gaining strength from those last few sets. And that's kind of his argument, is you're kind of getting a 2-for-1 doing this 1x20. He compares to other strength and conditioning programs where he argues that all those are kind of based on lower rep schemes, essentially. And there's some moderate rep schemes in there, like a 3x10, 5x15, but he has this in his lecture. And he compares that a lot of these are, basically all the same. They're all very high intensity, that really it's counterintuitive and counterproductive to an athlete for a number of reasons. Primarily because it puts them at risk of injury. And yeah, it can get them necessarily, and improve their raw strength, but is that necessarily what we're looking for a particular athlete? And, to add my 2 cents into here, I mean, he later on in his lecture, which I'll address, he talks about how you can actually later on you add a few more sets if you need to focus on something. And he talks about going as low as 8 repetitions for like a third set. So in my mind, he's kind of almost in that moderate range of like a 3x10 in some instances. Why would you want to use 1x20? His main kind of big arguments, one is just that people can't learn with high intensity, and we're talking about especially in the younger individuals. You can't learn a movement pattern doing high intensity. So the typical football athlete might be given a 5-3-1 program or a 5x5, and while those are great programs, you don't develop the ligaments, you don't develop the nervous systems, the tendons, the muscles. In a way, they're kind of meant to kind of learn to foster technique with lower repetitions and high intensity. And he makes the point of, the biggest argument that strength coaches have is that, my athlete, these people come to me and they can't squat yet, and they're in college and the collegiate level yet. And there's some truth to that everyone just kind of does these kind of high intense, basically powerlifting programs and never see any, they're still, lacking technique. And that's kind of what his argument is. The second kind of big point is it works on conditioning. Basically, his theory 1x20 is more conditioning for athletes versus, training for strength and intensity. So all those previous programs, what all these have in common, these are more or less raw strength programs, and this is a case a lot of strength conditioning coaches make. Are you training a football player or let's say a swimmer or a volleyball player to necessarily become better powerlifters? Or are you improving their goal to become better athletes overall? And that can be said even for the general person just going to the gym, working out. What is your true goal at the end of the day? So his basic argument is strength and intensity are not always inherently good, which is kind of counterintuitive to the modern strength and conditioning field, basically saying that the biggest things that make us progress are higher strength levels, in which in case are higher intensity. And his theory isn't necessarily the case. You actually can get just as strong, or can get improve your strength gains by having a lower intensity workout. And he's not the first one to necessarily say that. Why do it low intensity? His main thing, couple main points. It's low injury. Okay, so obviously you're not training at high levels of intensity, so it's low injury to an extent. In theory, you're doing more exercises, so that means more exposure to different movements and movement patterns. So that's kind of critical to just motor learning. Better exposure to different motor patterns. So you get a chance to kind of dabble in a lot of different exercises. He's saying better recovery. Okay, so you're not doing such an intense exercise in a certain given body part that you can recover faster, and possibly more frequency. You can train a little bit more often now because you didn't do such a high level of intensity. Now, I'm kind of going to jump in a little bit where I was kind of saving this towards the end. Now, if you're kind of looking at this intuitively a little bit, you're kind of saying, well, he doesn't address this in the video. He doesn't necessarily address, how many days off are you taking, at how many days per week, how long are the exercise sessions? Because even if you're doing a 1x20 and you're doing the tons of exercise that he's recommending, he recommends around 20 to even 35 exercises, even if they're single joint exercises. That stuff gradually builds up. So I don't know how many times per week he's actually doing it, but these things all do work, given the fact of, let's say you're doing this program probably no more than 3 times a week, because even if they're low intensity, it's still a lot of stuff. Also, again, it is low intensity, so he also stresses obviously it's going to be more repetitions if it's lower intensity. And he makes a case that, which is a little bit interesting, saying that you develop more capillaries, which therefore equals more effective exchange of nutrients. And if you can exchange or basically improve your capillary density in muscle tissue, you can recover more effectively and improve circulation through not only the workouts, but also throughout just your general training as an athlete. So it just makes you a more efficient athlete, which in some ways, I think makes sense to an extent. And again, also you can apply this to your own training if you want to. Motor muscular endurance is practical for more sports and activities. So he says this is the most practical way of training for most, especially team-oriented sports. So unless your sport is powerlifting, a 5x5 or even 5-3-1, that makes a lot of sense for your given sport. But if your sport is like a lot of stop-and-go sports where it is somewhat muscular endurance-based, ignoring the dominant energy system in a given play, you're doing something somewhat repetitively for an hour upwards of 2 hours. By increasing the circulation, he's also saying you build some important, structural components to your ligaments and tendon strength because there's greater blood flow. And we know that ligaments and tendons don't get a whole lot of blood flow, and they kind of need that circulation of fluid through repetitive movements and kind of need to kind of limbering up, so to speak. So you get that out of doing that high repetition, low intensity program. Now, some little critiques, not really a critique, it's just when you watch the video, you realize it's not really, like I said this in the beginning, it's not really a 1x20 totally set. You can give yourself your own program and make it kind of 1x20 if you'd like to. So 20 is the aim. It could be more, it could be less. He makes the point of when you make a program, don't change the program at all until they start kind of stagnating, so they're not progressing. So if on your program you have squats and bench pressing, even curls to an extent, and they're still adding weight and progressing to a certain extent. Let's say they're still getting 18 reps. Now the next session they did 19 repetitions the same weight. Keep it the same until they're stalling, and then you change up the exercises in the program. But he also says that there's different levels. He says on level 1 you would kind of stay at this one set. Level 2 you could actually start doing 2 sets of a selected exercise. Level 3 you could do 3 sets of certain selected exercise based on certain sport specific goals or your own specific goals. So if you're doing this for a general person hitting the gym, you could just do a 1x20 for all your exercises. But let's say you want to build up you're getting a little more advanced. You're maybe 2 years, 3 years in. You want to start advancing your biceps or your chest or something like that. Then you'd add a second or third set to those exercises. Is his point. And he doesn't really give any kind of arbitrary cutoff at level 1, 2, or 3. But that does indicate that you've advanced in your training. And he makes another kind of interesting point, this second bullet point, saying that each set could focus on strength, endurance, or power. That sometimes you might have 3 sets of a certain exercise, and each of those sets might have a different focus that he tries to focus. Once it might be a strength focus, meaning lower repetitions. One might be a little bit more higher endurance set, and one might be a power set. Now, this got a little bit kind of off track to me because his program started to go all different directions at this point. But he was saying during a certain number of exercises, you could hit a certain goal based on one set, though. So that's kind of sticking to his one set idea. So some important points if you're going to follow this. Obviously, if you're doing any kind of total body split, especially one like this, it's going to provide tons of exercise. Like I said, I'm going to give you an example here in a second. You should provide a proper warm-up, obviously, some sort of total body warm-up. The program itself stresses technique, and that's what I kind of love about this. And he stresses this a lot, that at any point, if the athlete is failing at technique, they got to lower their weight, and maybe they can work on higher repetitions at even lower intensity to kind of work on that technique. And all this stuff is really stressed on technique. If technique falls, you stop the exercise and lower the weight, which I think is really important. Limiting time in the gym. So this is important too. I mean, depending on how many times a week you're actually getting in here, doing 20 to 30 exercises. Yeah, if you add it all up, if it's all one set, but you're also to give yourself the rest periods, it might even out to a normal routine. But still, watch the time in the gym. Give yourself sufficient rest, because again, it is still a total body split. At least taking a day off between sessions. And this was his important point that I think makes some sense if you don't want to change it up and kind of give yourself a nice structure. If you're still making progress, he kind of stresses this point, keep the program the same. So like I said, depending on maybe not the whole entire thing, because you have so many exercises, like 30 exercises, one might be better, one might be worse than the other. But if there's some, the big ones that are kind of, top oriented in the beginning of the program, like your bigger compound lifts, if those are still progressing, keep that repetition range the same and add the weights, and don't change it up until you're starting to stall, and then you change something else. So you can see here from the screenshot, this is an example of a training program. Again, we don't know what sport he designed this for or what order he designed this for, but we're assuming it's starting with number 1 as the first exercise. But you can see he goes from a number of different single joint exercises and mixes up them into compound exercises. But I mean, the biggest thing off the bat is just seeing the sheer number of exercises that are in one, exercise session. Again, it's all one set of all those, we're assuming. And he even made a point in this video that it could go upwards even 35 exercises, like I said. And I think even in that slide, he said that it could have been more in that particular program. But, you kind of have to change some things up to traditionally how you would normally design an exercise program, because you can see, like I said, there's single joint stuff before compound stuff. You're doing a lot of isolation exercises that some strength conditioning coaches might deem really totally unnecessary at that point, especially things like wrist curls and the abduction adduction machine. But he makes the case throughout this video, throughout the presentation, that given on a certain sport, you're doing them disservice to not exercise those smaller muscles. And really, that's what more or less strength training should be about, is that specificity of a certain athlete and their movement patterns versus doing big global exercises that are more focused on just purely strength training and not, developing an athlete for their specific goal to excel on the field, whatever that might be.